The first human warship exploded 300 kilometers off our port bow, and I felt nothing but satisfaction. That feeling would not last. In fact, looking back on everything that followed, I can say with absolute certainty that the satisfaction I felt in that moment was the last time I would ever feel superior to a human being. My name is HFY. I am a senior tactical officer of the Velorothi Combined Fleet, and I am writing this because someone must record what happened when 12 species decided to go to war with humanity. Someone must explain why that was the worst decision in the history of our galaxy. I stood on the command bridge of the Axiom of Silence, our coalition flagship, watching the battle unfold across a tactical display the size of a small lake. 4,000 warships from 12 different species filled the space around Eridan's Reach, a human colony world on the edge of their territory. We had been planning this strike for 3 years. 3 years of secret meetings, coded transmissions, and quiet fleet buildups along the border. 3 years of smiling at human diplomats while we sharpened our knives behind our backs. The rationale was simple, at least on the surface. Humans expanded too fast. They adapted too quickly. They learned technologies in decades that other species needed centuries to master. And they fought too well, even in minor border disputes. Even when outnumbered, humans had a way of making victory cost more than anyone expected. The coalition's intelligence analysts had run the projections. If humanity continued growing at its current rate, they would surpass the combined military capability of all 12 coalition species within 60 years. The vote had been narrow, 7 species in favor, 5 opposed. But the decision was made, and now we were watching it play out in fire and shattered metal above a world of 14 million human civilians. I had spent 11 years studying humans as part of Velorothi military intelligence. I had read their literature, watched their historical recordings, analyzed their combat doctrines, and interviewed captured human soldiers from border skirmishes. I respected them. I will not pretend otherwise. They were creative, resilient, and remarkably adaptable, but I also shared the consensus view that had driven this attack. Humans were dangerous, yes, but they were still young, still primitive compared to species that had been sailing between stars for millennia. They had been part of the galactic community for barely 2 centuries. We had thousands of years of experience on them. We outnumbered them 20-1 at Eridan's Reach. Their defense fleet was maybe 200 ships, a mix of destroyers, frigates, and a handful of cruisers. Nothing that should have given 4,000 warships any trouble at all. And at first, it did not. Our opening salvo crippled their orbital defense platforms within minutes. The Torvathi shock fleet hit their left flank, while Chelorn heavy cruisers pushed up the center. The Dranathi, whose political leader High Arbiter Selthos had been the loudest voice calling for this war, sent their carrier groups around the far side of the planet to cut off retreat. The humans fought hard, I will give them that. Every ship engaged with everything it had. Their point defense systems were better than our intelligence had predicted, and their missile guidance was disturbingly accurate. We lost ships, more than we should have, given the numbers. A Velorothi destroyer took a direct hit to its reactor and broke apart in a bloom of white light. 2 Chelorn frigates collided, while trying to avoid a spread of human torpedoes that seemed to anticipate their evasive patterns. Then, something happened that I did not understand at the time, but that I have replayed in my mind 10,000 times since. A human destroyer, its hull cracked open and bleeding atmosphere, turned directly into the path of a Torvathi battlecruiser. It accelerated to full speed, well beyond what its damaged frame should have survived, and drove itself straight into the battlecruiser's forward section. The explosion consumed both ships entirely. I watched it happen on the tactical display, and I felt a cold finger trace down my spine. Not because of the destruction. I had seen ships die before. What disturbed me was the precision. That destroyer had not been out of control. It had not been spinning wildly in a death spiral. Its course correction in those final seconds was calculated, deliberate, and perfect. The crew had known exactly what they were doing. They had chosen it. Around me, the coalition commanders were cheering. The human fleet was falling back, pulling away from Eridan's Reach in what looked like a disorganized retreat. Admiral Drenix of the Torvathi clapped his massive hands together and declared that the humans were breaking. Selthos, watching from his private chamber via secure link, congratulated the fleet on its historic achievement. I was not cheering. Something felt wrong, and I could not identify what it was. Then every human ship stopped firing. Not one by one, not in a staggered withdrawal. Every single human vessel in the system ceased all weapons activity at exactly the same moment. I checked the timestamp 3 times to be sure. The synchronization was accurate to within 1/100th of a second, across 200 ships, spread across millions of kilometers of space. Silence fell across every communication frequency. The human ships hung motionless in the void, dead quiet, like they were waiting for something. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. I counted every one of those seconds. They were the longest 11 seconds of my life, and given what came after, that is saying a great deal. Then a transmission cut through every channel, every frequency, every encryption layer the Coalition used. It came through in 12 languages simultaneously, one for each species in the Coalition, and the translation was flawless. Not the clumsy machine translation we were used to from human diplomatic channels. This was perfect, idiomatically perfect, as if they had native speakers of every Coalition language standing by for exactly this moment. The voice was human, female, calm in a way that made the calmness itself feel like a weapon. She said, "You just made the last mistake this Coalition will ever make. We gave you kindness. You heard weakness. So now hear this. We are done being kind." The transmission ended. And then, in a display of navigational precision that our best pilots could not have replicated in 1,000 attempts, every human ship in the system jumped to hyperspace at exactly the same instant. They did not leave one by one. They did not stagger their departures to avoid gravitational interference, which is what every textbook on hyperspace navigation says you must do when jumping multiple ships from the same area. They all jumped together, in perfect formation, and the fact that none of them were torn apart by overlapping jump fields told me something that made my stomach clench. They had technology we did not know about, technology that was generations beyond what they had ever shown us. The Coalition fleet erupted in celebration. Admiral Drenix called it a rout. Selthos called it validation. The other commanders congratulated each other and began planning the advance to the next human system. I returned to my quarters and pulled up the battle data. I ran the numbers on the human retreat 7 times, because the first 6 times I was certain I had made an error. I had not. The human ships had not retreated in a disorganized scatter. Their withdrawal pattern was geometrically perfect. Every ship had moved to a precisely calculated position relative to every other ship before jumping. The pattern was not random. It was not the result of panic or desperation. It was a formation, a specific, deliberate, pre-planned formation that had been executed under fire with zero communication between ships. Which meant one of 2 things. Either every human captain in that fleet had independently calculated the exact same withdrawal pattern in the middle of a battle, which was impossible, or they had planned this. All of it. The defense, the fighting retreat, the synchronized stop, the message, the jump. Every single moment of that battle had been choreographed in advance. The humans had not been defeated. They had not been routed. They had performed a planned withdrawal with a precision that made our best military exercises look like children stumbling in the dark. I sat in my quarters for a long time after that, staring at the data on my screen. The celebration continued outside my door. I could hear Velarathi officers laughing, congratulating each other, already composing messages home about their great victory. I did not feel victorious. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and dark, and I had just watched the entire Coalition take one step closer to falling in. 3 days passed, and the humans vanished. Not retreated, not regrouped, vanished. Every human ship, station, satellite, and probe across all 41 of their known systems went completely dark. No transmissions, no engine signatures, no electromagnetic output of any kind. 200 billion human beings spread across an entire arm of the galaxy simply stopped being visible. I had seen species go silent before. It usually meant they were dying, that some internal catastrophe had crippled their infrastructure, and they were too busy surviving to communicate. But this was different. This was not the silence of collapse. This was the silence of a predator holding its breath. I tried to explain this to the Coalition War Council. I stood before the assembled commanders and political leaders in the strategic chamber of the Axiom of Silence and presented my analysis. I showed them the geometric precision of the human retreat. I showed them the synchronization data. I showed them the communication intercepts that proved the humans had broadcast their final message in 12 perfect translations, which meant they had been preparing for this specific scenario for years. High Arbiter Selthos listened to my entire presentation, then dismissed it with a wave of one slender hand. The humans were broken, he said. The silence proved it. A species that had just lost a major battle and had its colony bombarded was not going to mount a credible counteroffensive. He ordered the fleet to advance through the Kalan corridor, a narrow hyperspace lane that led toward human core territory. We would press the advantage, he said. We would end this quickly. I objected. I was overruled. The fleet jumped to the Kalan corridor and found it empty. Completely, perfectly, unsettlingly empty. The navigational buoys that humans had placed throughout the corridor were still active, still broadcasting their positioning data. But something about the data nagged at me. I ran a comparison against our pre-war charts and found that 17 of the 42 buoys had been repositioned. The shifts were tiny, less than a kilometer in most cases, but they were consistent. Someone had moved them recently, and deliberately. I reported this to Fleet Commander Drenix. He told me I was being paranoid. 6 hours into our advance, the Torvathi scouting squadron disappeared. 15 ships, no distress signal, no weapons fire detected, no debris on sensors. Their transponder signals simply stopped, as if someone had reached out and switched them off. One moment they were there, cruising ahead of the main fleet in standard scouting formation. The next moment, they were gone. Drenix dispatched search teams. They found nothing. Not a fragment of hull, not a wisp of atmosphere, not a single escape pod. 15 ships and over 4,000 crew members had ceased to exist without leaving a trace. 8 hours later, a Chelorn supply convoy, 20 light minutes behind the main fleet, went dark. Same pattern. No warning, no distress call, no debris, just silence where ships had been. Then a Velarathi patrol wing on the fleet's starboard flank. 12 ships, gone. Then a Dranathi communications relay station, crew of 200, gone. The losses were small in absolute terms, but they were spread across the entire coalition formation. Every disappearance happened in a different location, at unpredictable intervals, and to a different species. There was no pattern that our tactical algorithms could identify, no way to predict where the next strike would fall. I spent a sleepless night staring at the tactical display, watching the gaps appear in our formation. And then I saw it. The pattern was not in where the attacks happened. It was in where they did not happen. The humans were avoiding our strongest concentrations. They were picking off isolated units, stragglers, outliers, ships that were alone or in small groups, ships that could be destroyed quickly and completely, leaving no survivors and no evidence. They were hunting us, not with the brute force of a fleet engagement, not with the overwhelming firepower that a species supposedly fighting for its survival should be using. They were hunting us the way a predator hunts, with patience and precision, and an intimate knowledge of exactly where their prey was vulnerable. And that intimate knowledge was the part that chilled me to my core. The humans were finding blind spots in every species' sensor technology. They were exploiting weaknesses in detection systems that were classified at the highest levels. The only way they could know about those weaknesses was if they had been studying us. Not for months, not since the war started, for years, maybe decades. Every peaceful trade mission, every cultural exchange, every diplomatic visit, every joint military exercise we had ever conducted with humans had been an intelligence-gathering operation. They had learned everything about us while smiling and shaking our hands. The coalition began to fracture. The Torvathi accused the Velarathi of selling sensor data to the humans. The Chelorn demanded that their ships be pulled back to protect their supply lines. The Mavathi, who had voted against the war in the first place, openly questioned whether the coalition should seek a ceasefire. Selthos held the alliance together through sheer political force, but even he could not stop the fear that was spreading through the fleet like a disease. We had launched with 4,000 ships. In 5 days of advancing through empty space, we had lost nearly 300. all to an enemy we had not seen since the first battle. On the sixth day, a coalition patrol finally managed to destroy a human ship. A small strike craft, barely larger than a shuttle, that was caught mid-attack on a Drenathi frigate. The patrol ships converged and hit it from 4 directions simultaneously. It took all 4 ships firing together to bring down something that small, which should have told us something by itself, but we were so desperate for a victory that no one paused to consider what that meant. The wreckage was recovered and brought aboard the Axiom of Silence for analysis. I was part of the team that examined it. What we found changed everything. The strike craft's weapon systems had configuration settings and operational modes that no one in the coalition had ever seen. The energy output ratings were 3 times higher than anything humans had ever used in any previous engagement. The targeting systems operated on principles that our physicists needed 2 days just to understand conceptually, and the hull was made of a composite material that did not exist in any coalition database. But the truly devastating discovery was in the manufacturing dates stamped into the components. This was not new technology. This ship had not been built in the 3 days since the war started. The newest component was 4 years old. The oldest was 11. The humans had possessed this technology for over a decade. Every fight the coalition had ever had with humans, every border skirmish, every tense standoff, every engagement where we had matched their weapons against ours and concluded that we were roughly equal, they had been using a fraction of what they had. They had been fighting us with one hand behind their back, holding back capabilities that would have ended any conflict instantly. I stared at the weapon data on my screen until the numbers blurred. My hands were shaking, and I could not make them stop. In 11 years of studying humans, I thought I had understood them. I thought I had taken their measure. I had been wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong about some minor detail. I had been fundamentally, catastrophically, existentially wrong about what humans were. They were always this strong. They had always been this far ahead of us. They had just chosen not to show us. And now we had given them a reason to stop hiding. The emergency klaxon tore through the axiom of silence at a pitch I had never heard before, the pitch reserved for imminent existential threat. I was in the intelligence analysis chamber on Deck 14, still staring at the wreckage data from the captured human strike craft, when every light in the room turned red and the ship lurched hard enough to throw me against the wall. I pulled myself up and ran for the command bridge. The corridors were chaos. Officers and crew of a dozen different species running in every direction, shouting in their native languages, the universal translators struggling to keep up with the overlapping voices. I pushed through them, climbed 2 emergency ladders when the lifts went offline, and reached the bridge just in time to see the tactical display light up like a star going supernova. We were at the Osirian staging ground. This was supposed to be safe territory, deep behind coalition lines, hundreds of light years from the nearest human system. This was where our supply ships gathered, where our damaged vessels came for repair, where our reserves waited. It was the logistical heart of the entire war effort, protected by layered defense platforms, sensor nets that extended half a light year in every direction, and a permanent garrison of 600 warships. The humans were already inside the perimeter, not approaching from outside, not fighting through the sensor nets and defense platforms, already inside, as if they had been there the whole time. And when our analysts reviewed the sensor logs afterward, that is exactly what they concluded. Human ships had been hiding in the Osirian asteroid fields for at least 3 weeks, drifting cold and silent among the rocks, their engines off, their signatures masked by some form of stealth technology that our sensors could not penetrate. They had been watching us gather. They had been counting our ships, mapping our formations, identifying our command vessels. They had been waiting. I reached the bridge, just as the first human strike group hit our carrier formation. 3 Chelorn supercarriers, each one carrying over 200 combat craft, were destroyed in the first 90 seconds. The explosions were so close together that on the tactical display, they merged into a single bloom of light. The shockwave rattled the axiom of silence, even from 50 kilometers away. Fleet Commander Drenix was screaming orders from the command platform. Form up, concentrate fire, protect the flagships. But his orders were already irrelevant. The humans were not attacking in a pattern that any of our defensive formations were designed to counter. They were hitting us from every direction simultaneously, appearing out of the asteroid field in groups of 10 or 20, striking with devastating precision and vanishing back into the rocks before our guns could track them. I watched a human frigate engage a Torvathi battlecruiser 3 times its size. The frigate came in low and fast, rotating on its axis to present its smallest profile, and fired a concentrated beam that I had never seen before, something that burned white-blue on our sensors and hit with enough force to punch through the battlecruiser's forward shields in a single shot. The battlecruiser returned fire with everything it had: plasma cannons, missile batteries, point defense systems, all of it hammering the space where the frigate should have been. But the frigate was not there anymore. It had already moved, executing a turn at a speed and angle that should have killed everyone aboard from the acceleration forces alone. It came around behind the battlecruiser, fired twice more, and the battlecruiser broke in half. The whole engagement took 11 seconds. I stood on the bridge of the Axiom of Silence and watched this happen across the entire battlefield. Dozens of similar engagements playing out simultaneously. And I realized something that made my blood feel like ice water in my veins. The humans were not just fighting well, they were fighting like us, like all of us. That frigate had used a Velarathi flanking approach against the Torvathi battlecruiser. Across the field, I could see human ships using Celeron ambush patterns against Dranathi carriers, Mavathi encirclement tactics against Velarathi cruisers. They were using our own doctrines against us, mixing and matching techniques from every species in the coalition, combining them in ways we had never imagined. Every joint exercise, every shared tactical briefing, every time a coalition species had trained alongside human forces in the name of interstellar cooperation, the humans had been learning. Not just observing, not just taking notes, learning at a depth that went beyond professional interest. They had internalized our fighting styles so completely that they could use them better than we could. I pulled up the casualty reports and wished I had not. In the first 10 minutes of the battle, the coalition had lost over 140 ships. The humans had lost 9. The battle raged for an hour. I will not describe every engagement, because the details would be repetitive, and the outcome was never in doubt from the first minute. What I will describe is the moment that changed the war, the galaxy, and my understanding of what humans truly are. It happened 53 minutes into the battle. The Axiom of Silence had taken fire. Not critical damage, but enough to crack our portside armor and knock out 2 of our secondary weapon arrays. We were pulling back, trying to put distance between ourselves and the main engagement zone, when space itself seemed to split open directly above us. A hyperspace exit point blossomed into existence less than 2 kilometers from our hull, far too close. Dangerously, impossibly close. The energy wash from the exit alone overloaded half our sensor arrays and sent cascading failures through our navigation systems. And then the ship came through. I had spent my career studying warships. I had memorized the silhouettes of every combat vessel operated by every species in the coalition. I had reviewed every piece of intelligence we had ever gathered on human military assets. I had never seen anything like the ship that emerged from hyperspace above us that day. It was enormous. Not just large in the way that capital ships are large, but vast in a way that suggested a different philosophy of war entirely. It bristled with weapon systems that our sensors could not even classify, arrays and projectors, and launch systems that did not correspond to any known weapons technology. Its hull was a deep matte black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and along its flanks, barely visible against the darkness, were symbols I did not recognize. Later analysis would determine that the ship was approximately 4 kilometers long. Our largest battleships were 1.5. Every human ship in the battle zone immediately ceased offensive operations. Not a retreat, not a pause. They simply stopped shooting and formed up in a defensive perimeter around the massive vessel, as if its arrival was a signal they had all been waiting for. The giant ship did not fire. It did not need to. Its mere presence had frozen the battle. Every coalition ship that could still maneuver was pulling back, and I could hear the panic in the communications traffic. Commanders demanding identification, sensor officers reporting readings that they insisted had to be errors. Weapons officers quietly informing their captains that their targeting systems could not achieve a lock on the new arrival. Then a communication channel opened. Not a broadcast, a direct, targeted transmission to the Coalition War Council aboard the Axiom of Silence. It cut through our encryption as if it did not exist. A face appeared on the command bridge's primary display. Human, female, dark skin, close-cropped hair, eyes that held the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of emotion, but from its absolute mastery. She wore a uniform I did not recognize, darker and more austere than the standard human military dress I had seen in intelligence files. The rank insignia on her collar indicated a fleet admiral, but the design was different from any human rank structure in our databases. She introduced herself as Admiral Lena Vasquez, and she spoke in perfect Velarathi, not translated, not synthesized, but spoken with the accent and cadence of someone who had learned the language from a native speaker. She said she was offering the Coalition one opportunity to end this. She laid out terms: immediate withdrawal from all human territory, return of all civilians taken or displaced from Eridan's reach, a public acknowledgement by every Coalition government that the attack had been unprovoked, and reparations for the damage done to the colony. The terms were strict, but they were not cruel. They did not demand territory. They did not require the dissolution of the Coalition. They did not ask for unconditional surrender. They asked for accountability. High Arbiter Selthos was not on the bridge. He was in his private chamber, watching through a secure feed. But his voice came through the command channel with all the arrogance that had brought us to this moment. He called it a bluff. He said the humans were overextended, that this one large ship did not change the mathematics of the war. He said the Coalition would not be intimidated by theater. Vasquez listened to every word without expression. When Selthos finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, and I want to be very precise about what that smile looked like, because I have never seen anything like it before or since. It was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was not cold or cruel. It was sad, deeply, genuinely sad, as if she had been hoping for a different answer and was now grieving for what was about to happen. She said, "I was hoping you would say that. Now I do not have to hold them back anymore." The communication ended. The giant ship, which I would later learn was called the Acheron, turned its forward section toward the Osirian Staging Ground's primary defense station. It was a massive installation, armored and shielded beyond anything in the Coalition's standard military architecture, housing 5,000 personnel and enough firepower to hold off a fleet. The Acheron fired once. I do not have the technical vocabulary to describe what the weapon did, because no such vocabulary existed before that moment. The defense station did not explode. It did not break apart. It did not burn. It simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a massive structure of metal and composite and energy shields. The next moment there was nothing. Not debris, not expanding gas, not residual energy. Nothing. As if the station had never been built. As if the 5,000 people inside it had never been born. The sensors registered the event as a gravitational anomaly, followed by a complete absence of matter in the target zone. The weapons analysts would later theorize that the beam had disrupted molecular bonds at the quantum level, essentially convincing every atom in the station that it was no longer part of a larger structure. The atoms had not been destroyed. They had been scattered, reduced to individual particles so diffuse that they were indistinguishable from background radiation. The bridge of the Axiom of Silence was silent. Absolutely silent. I could hear the hum of the life support systems and the distant vibration of the engines. Nothing else. Every officer, every commander, every political observer on that bridge stood frozen, staring at the empty space where a defense station housing 5,000 people had existed 3 seconds ago. I understood then, in that moment, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow to the chest. We had not started a war with a young, primitive species that was getting too big for its territory. We had poked a sleeping giant. We had mistaken its gentleness for weakness, its patience for inability, its restraint for lack of capacity. And now it was awake. The Coalition shattered, not over weeks or months, in hours. The Chelorn were the first to break. Their fleet commander broadcast a surrender on open channels before the echoes of the Acheron's weapon had faded from our sensors. The Mavathi followed immediately, transmitting a formal apology addressed directly to Admiral Vasquez. The Torvathi pulled their remaining ships into a tight defensive cluster and stopped responding to coalition communications entirely. Within 6 hours of the Osirian attack, 3 species had surrendered outright, 2 more had withdrawn their fleets and sealed their borders, and the remaining 7 were fracturing along fault lines that the stress of defeat had made impossible to ignore. I stood on the bridge of the axiom of silence as the retreat order finally came through. Not from Selthos, who had gone conspicuously silent, but from the Velarathi High Command back home, who had seen the sensor data from Osirian and decided that survival was more important than pride. We were to withdraw to Velarathi space immediately, no further offensive operations, no engagement with human forces unless fired upon first. We ran. There is no dignified way to say it. 4,000 ships had set out to conquer humanity, and the survivors ran for home like frightened animals. During the retreat, I learned the full scope of what humanity unleashed looked like when it operated without restraint. The reports came in waves, each one worse than the last. Human fleets had launched coordinated strikes across the entire theater of operations, not just at Osirian, but at every coalition military asset within range. Hyperspace relay stations that had taken decades to build were destroyed in minutes. Supply depots that fed entire fleet groups were reduced to debris. Communication networks that connected species across thousands of light-years went dark as the nodes were systematically eliminated. All of it happened within the same 6-hour window. I sat in the intelligence analysis chamber and tried to comprehend the logistics of what I was seeing. The coordination required to strike hundreds of targets across hundreds of light-years within the same 6-hour window was beyond anything the coalition could have achieved with a year of planning and preparation. The humans had done it in 3 days, or rather, they had executed it in 3 days. The planning, I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach, had been done years ago. They had contingency plans for this. Detailed, comprehensive, ready-to-execute contingency plans for a war with the coalition. They had identified every critical piece of infrastructure, mapped every supply route, cataloged every communication node, and pre-positioned assets to strike them all simultaneously. While they were smiling at us across diplomatic tables, while they were sharing cultural exchanges and attending our festivals and learning our languages, they had been preparing for the possibility that we would turn on them. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake during the long retreat home, was that they had done all of this defensively. They had not been planning to attack us. They had been planning for the day when we attacked them. They had looked at the galaxy, looked at the coalition, looked at 12 species that smiled and traded and talked about peace, and they had seen what we truly were, what we were capable of, and they had prepared accordingly. They knew us better than we knew ourselves. We reached Velarathi space after 4 days of hard running, and I was summoned to a meeting that I had not expected. The captain of a human destroyer had made contact with our fleet commander and requested permission to send a representative aboard the Axiom of Silence for a direct conversation. The Velarathi High Command, desperate for any path that did not end in the annihilation they had witnessed at Osirian, agreed. Captain Dren Okoro came aboard with 4 escorts. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark brown skin and a shaved head that emphasized the sharp lines of his jaw. He moved through our corridors with the easy confidence of someone who was not afraid, and the 4 human soldiers who flanked him moved with a fluid alertness that made every Velarathi guard we passed look clumsy by comparison. I was assigned as the Velarathi liaison for the meeting. I led Okoro and his escorts to the diplomatic chamber on Deck 7, and I studied him every step of the way, looking for any sign of the rage and bloodlust that our propaganda had promised we would find in humans who had been pushed to war. I found none. Okoro was quiet, professional, and precise. He sat across the table from our fleet commander and laid out terms for the Velarathi specifically. They were firm but measured. Military disarmament along the border, full intelligence sharing regarding the coalition's war planning, a formal public statement acknowledging Velarathi participation in the attack, reparations to be determined by an independent tribunal, monitoring of military research facilities for a period of 50 years. Strict terms, but not cruel ones. Not the terms of a conqueror who wanted to grind his enemy into dust. Our fleet commander asked why. Why these terms, and not harsher ones? Why not demand territory, vassalage, the dissolution of the Velarathi military entirely? After what we had done, after the unprovoked attack on a civilian colony, no one would have faulted the humans for demanding everything. Okoro looked at our fleet commander for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I do not know why he singled me out. Perhaps he had read my intelligence profile and knew who I was. Perhaps it was random, but he looked directly at me when he answered. He said that humans did not want subjects. They did not want an empire. They wanted to live in a galaxy where they did not have to sleep with one eye open, wondering which of their neighbors was going to attack them next. He said these terms were designed to make the Velarathi safe to live next to, not to punish us for being dangerous. I asked him a question then, one that had been burning in my mind since the Acheron fired its weapon at Osirian. I asked him how long humanity had been this powerful, how long they had possessed the technology to fight the way they were fighting now. He told me the truth, and the truth was worse than anything I had imagined. Humans had developed weapons capable of matching the Coalition's combined firepower within 50 years of first contact with the galactic community. 50 years. They had looked at what the galaxy had to offer, studied the technologies of a dozen different species, and leapfrogged all of it within half a century. And then they had locked those weapons away, classified them, restricted them to a single branch of their military that operated in absolute secrecy. Because they had known, even then, that if the galaxy saw what they could really do, someone would start exactly the war that was happening now. They had hidden their strength not to deceive us, but to protect us. To give the galaxy time to get used to them, to see them as neighbors and partners rather than threats. They had tried to be gentle, and we had repaid their gentleness with an unprovoked attack on their homes and families. Okoro said something else in that meeting, something that I have carried with me every day since. He said, "You called us death. You think it is because we kill. It is not. It is because we decide who lives." I did not understand what he meant. Not then. It would take another 3 days for me to understand, and by then, the galaxy would look very different. The meeting ended with provisional agreement on the terms. Okoro left our ship with the same quiet confidence he had arrived with. As he walked back through our corridors toward the docking bay where his shuttle waited, every Velarathi crew member we passed stepped back against the walls to let him through. Not because they had been ordered to, because they could not bring themselves to stand in his path. I was writing my summary of the meeting when the report came in about the Drenathi. High Arbiter Selthos had not surrendered. He had not even responded to the human terms. Instead, he had done something so catastrophically stupid that when I read the report, I initially assumed it was a translation error. The Drenathi had launched a biological weapon at a human colony, not a military target, a colony, a world called Haven's Rest, population 600,000, mostly agricultural workers and their families. The bioweapon was a modified pathogen, designed to attack human cellular structure specifically. It was sophisticated, targeted, and brutally effective. 32,000 humans died before emergency response teams could synthesize a counteragent. Among the dead were over 4,000 children. I read the casualty figures and felt something I had never felt before in my career as a military officer. Not anger, not horror, not even fear, though I was afraid. I felt grief. Real, genuine grief for people I had never met, for children I would never know, who had died because a politician on the other side of the galaxy could not accept that he had lost. And then I felt something else, a deep, primal, animal terror, because I knew what the humans were going to do next. The communication request came through within an hour. Captain Okoro again, requesting to speak with me directly, not with the fleet commander, with me. I opened the channel. Okoro's face appeared on my screen. He looked different from the man I had met hours earlier. Not angry. That was the thing that struck me immediately, and that strikes me still. He was not angry. The expression on his face was something far worse than anger. It was the expression of a man who had made a decision that he knew he could never take back. A door had closed behind his eyes. The last door. The last restraint. He told me what had happened at Haven's Rest. He told me the number of dead. He told me about the children. Then he told me what was going to happen next. The Velarathi had accepted terms. The Chelaron had surrendered. The Mavathi had apologized. This was not about them anymore. This was about the Drenathi, and specifically about High Arbiter Selthos, who had murdered 32,000 civilians including 4,000 children because his pride would not let him accept defeat. Okoro told me that what came next would not be like what I had seen before. Until now, he said, the humans had been fighting a war. Measured, strategic, aimed at military targets with the goal of ending the conflict. What came next would not be a war, it would be a reckoning. He asked me to pass a message to the Velarathi High Command. Stay out of Drenathi space. Do not interfere. Do not try to negotiate on the Drenathi's behalf. Just stay clear and wait. Then he said something that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. He said, tell the Drenathi to pray to whatever they worship. We are coming. The channel closed. I sat alone in the silence of my quarters, staring at the blank screen, listening to the hum of the ship around me. And I understood, for the first time, what Okoro had meant when he said, humans decide who lives. They had been deciding to let us live. All of us. Every species in the galaxy. Every day that humanity existed among us. They were making an active choice not to use the power they had. Not because they lacked the capability. Not because something restrained them. Because they chose to be kind. The Drenathi had just taken that choice away from them. The Velarathi fleet received the message and pulled back to our homeworld. We turned our long-range sensors toward Drenathi space and watched. I stood in the Axiom of Silence's primary observation center with 24 other officers and analysts, staring at holographic displays that showed us what was happening in Drenathi territory in near real time. What we saw over the next 72 hours redefined my understanding of what a military force could accomplish. The humans did not attack the Drenathi. The word attack is insufficient. It implies a contest, an exchange of force between two parties that might go either way. What the humans did was more like surgery. If surgery were performed with weapons that could crack a planet's crust, and the surgeon had decided that the disease needed to be removed completely. In the first 12 hours, the human fleet eliminated every Drenathi military shipyard. Not damaged. Eliminated. Each one was struck by a concentrated assault that left nothing behind, executed with a precision that avoided all surrounding civilian infrastructure. Shipyards in orbit above populated worlds were destroyed without a single piece of debris falling on the cities below. In the second 12 hours, they moved to weapons factories, military research facilities, and munitions depots. Same precision, same completeness. Installations that had taken the Drenathi centuries to build were dismantled in hours. In the third period, they eliminated the Drenathi fleet. What was left of it anyway? Most of the Drenathi captains had tried to scatter, hiding their ships among civilian shipping lanes and near-populated stations, hoping that the humans would not risk civilian casualties to reach them. The humans reached them anyway. Every single one. They threaded their attacks through population centers with an accuracy that defied belief, destroying Drenathi warships that were docked at civilian stations without damaging the stations themselves. One Drenathi cruiser had hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid that also housed a mining colony of 15,000 civilians. The human strike team inserted a boarding party, captured the cruiser, flew it out of the asteroid, and then destroyed it in open space. The mining colony was not scratched. I watched this unfold on the displays and felt my understanding of humanity shift on its foundations like a building in an earthquake. Because this was the part that terrified me more than the weapons, more than the technology, more than the silent and total destruction of the Drenathi military. The humans could have destroyed everything, every city, every world, every living Drenathi. They had the power. They had the provocation, a biological attack on a civilian colony that killed children. No tribunal in the galaxy would have condemned them for total retaliation. And they chose not to. They dismantled the Drenathi military with surgical precision, and they did not touch a single civilian target. Not one hospital, not one school, not one residential district. They were showing the galaxy exactly what they could do, and exactly how much restraint they were still exercising, even now, even after their children had been murdered by a weapon designed to kill them in the most painful way possible. That was the demonstration. That was the message. Not the destruction, but the precision. Not the power, but the control. They were telling the galaxy, we could end you, all of you. And we are choosing not to. Even now, even after everything you have done, we are still choosing. On the fourth day, Selthos was captured. Not killed. Captured. A human special operations team infiltrated his private bunker on the Dranathi homeworld, bypassed security systems that were supposed to be impenetrable, and took him alive. They did not harm a single member of his household staff. They did not damage the bunker. They simply appeared inside it, took Selthos, and disappeared. I watched the footage of his capture when the humans released it publicly. Two of the human soldiers were smiling, not smirking, not gloating, smiling with a grim satisfaction that said they had accomplished exactly what they set out to do. The humans put Selthos on trial, not a military tribunal, not a summary execution, a public, transparent, meticulously fair trial, broadcast across every communication network in the galaxy. They appointed a Dranathi defense attorney, provided by a Dranathi legal advocacy group that the humans had contacted and funded specifically for this purpose. They presented evidence, they heard testimony. They followed procedures so scrupulously fair that even the Dranathi government's official observers could find no fault with them. That trial was the most devastating weapon in humanity's arsenal. Not the Acheron with its reality-erasing beam, not the stealth ships that could hide in plain sight, not the strike teams that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The trial. Because the trial said something that no weapon could say. It said that even in their fury, even unleashed, even after burying 4,000 of their children, humans still believed in justice. They still insisted on it. They refused to become what the coalition had accused them of being. Selthos was found guilty. He was sentenced to imprisonment on a human station, to be held under conditions that were, by any objective measure, humane. He would receive medical care, proper nutrition, communication with his family, and legal representation for any appeals. The humans did not execute him. They did not torture him. They locked him in a clean cell and treated him with a dignity he had never shown them. The war ended, not with a treaty signing or a grand ceremony. It just stopped. The humans withdrew their fleets to their borders. They did not occupy Dranathi territory. They did not install puppet governments. They did not demand vassal states or tribute. They imposed strict terms, disarmament, reparations, oversight. But the terms were designed to prevent future aggression, not to humiliate. Then, they went home. 200 billion humans across 41 systems, possessing technology and military power that could have made them rulers of the galaxy, went home and returned to their lives. Their ships powered down, their weapons went back into storage. The terrifying war machine that had dismantled the coalition in a matter of weeks folded itself up and went quiet. I wrote my after-action report in the weeks that followed. It took me a long time. Not because I lacked information, but because I struggled to find words adequate to describe what I had witnessed. The galaxy had called humans death. We had whispered the name in intelligence briefings and diplomatic back channels for decades. We said it because of their history, because of what they had done to each other during their long and bloody climb to civilization. We said it because of the barely restrained ferocity we glimpsed in their eyes during negotiations, the edge of steel beneath every friendly smile. We said it because every threat assessment, every war game, every strategic simulation we ran, came back with the same conclusion: do not provoke the humans. And then we had provoked them anyway. In my report, I wrote that the galaxy's name for humans was accurate, but for the wrong reasons. We called them death because we saw their capacity for destruction and assumed that was the entirety of what they were. We were wrong. I had watched them unleash that capacity. I had seen weapons that could unmake matter at the molecular level. I had watched a fleet of stealth ships hunt a coalition of 12 species across hundreds of light years with the patience and precision of apex predators. I had stood in the same room as a human officer who carried the deaths of 4,000 children in his eyes and still spoke with restraint, still offered fair terms, still chose precision over slaughter. Humans are not called death because they kill. They are called death because they hold the power of life and death in their hands at every moment, and they are always, always aware of it. Every interaction, every handshake, every smile across a diplomatic table, they are making an active, conscious choice to be gentle. It is not their nature. Gentleness does not come naturally to a species forged in the fire of 10,000 years of self-inflicted war. It is a discipline, a practice, a daily decision to be something better than what they know they can be. And we looked at that discipline and called it weakness. I watched the human fleet withdraw from Drenathi space on the long-range displays. Thousands of warships, each one carrying weapons that could crack moons and shatter civilizations, turning away from a defeated enemy and going home. Going back to their farms and their universities, and their art, and their children. Putting the instruments of death back in their cases and picking up the instruments of life. I thought about what Captain Okoro had said to me. We decide who lives, and I realized that for all the centuries humanity had been part of the galactic community, they had been deciding, every single day, to let us live. Not because they had to, not because they lacked alternatives, because they wanted to live in a galaxy of neighbors, not subjects. Because they believed that the species around them deserved the chance to grow and learn and maybe, eventually, become something worthy of the trust humanity was placing in them. We failed that trust. 12 species, with thousands of years of civilization between them, looked at the gentlest hand that had ever been extended to them and decided to cut it off. And humanity's response, after the grief and the fury and the reckoning, was to extend that hand again, scarred, wary, but open. I finished my report and filed it with Velarathi High Command with a single recommendation. Never again. Never provoke humanity again. Not because of what they would do to us, though that alone should be sufficient motivation, but because of what it would say about us if we forced them to stop being kind a second time. The universe calls them death. I have seen why. I have seen them unleashed, seen the full terrible scope of what they can be when they choose to stop holding back. And I pray, with every fiber of my being, that the galaxy never gives them a reason to make that choice again. Because the next time, I am not sure they will choose to be gentle when it is over. And I would not blame them.